Hello and welcome to the first birthday episode of Essex by the Sea. I'm Owen Ward, exploring the Essex coast, finding out about the amazing and interesting stories it has to offer. Don't forget to subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and if you like what you hear, tell your friends about Essex by the Sea as well. Sadly, there's no birthday cake, but for this episode I'm out on the Dengie Peninsula at a former RAF base, standing next to the Bradwell Airfield Memorial is Eric Simonelli. Eric, thank you ever so much for joining me here on the podcast.
Oh, thank you for inviting.
Now, you've been researching the history of the base and the stories of the personnel that were stationed here.
Yeah, it's quite an amazing story that's going right back into the late 1930s. In fact, even before that, they'd proposed an airfield and a bombing range here in mid-1920s. Didn't come to fruition to the late 1930s, where they built a bombing range out by St Peter's Chapel, which is just on the coast.
So when did the airfield here actually open then? You say it was in the 30s.
Right, the small grass strip, which was only really there for refuelling and rearming, and that was only staffed by about 30 other ranks and a sergeant. The airfield that most people really know about is RAF Bradwell Bay, which they started to construct it early in 1941. The first station personnel started arriving in late 1941, and the first squadron arrived here in 1942, which was 418 Royal Canadian Air Force.
Why here at Bradwell though?
I think because we were quite near the coast, so it was a shorter distance to get across to Holland and Belgium and places like that, which was the main purpose of this airfield, was to do intruder raids onto the near continent around sort of Eindhoven, Holland, those sort of places.
And it's quite a remote area even today. I guess back in the 30s, it would have just been farmland, wouldn't it, this area?
It was predominantly agricultural, so it was probably quite a shock for them to get an airfield here at all. There was certainly a lot of protest about the firing range one. They were protesting about that from the 1925. But it must have been quite a shock to get such a large airfield with 3 runways, and although it wasn't a designated emergency landing ground, it was also served as a purpose for bombers coming back from longer flights over Germany to land here. If they'd been shot up, we would be the first port of call that they'd come to. So we often had Lancasters landing here, B-17s, the Americans were coming in here. There was all sorts of aircraft.
As you say, we're right on the east coast here, so it really would have been one of the first places to touch down upon for stricken aircraft that were sort of limping back to the UK.
Certainly was, and they knew they could land here, refuel if they was running low on fuel. They could get medical help for those that were injured, which wasn't uncommon. So the medical services on the site were kept busy day and night.
Being right on the coast, I think I read somewhere that there was quite an innovative way to try and disperse fog, because obviously that would have been a bit of an issue.
FIDO, and I'm not talking about the dog. FIDO stands for Fog Intensive Dispersal Operation, and basically it didn't come in till probably about 1943 or even 44. They put lines of petrol burners down the main runway, and they could light them up using an enormous amount of fuel. I worked out that in today's rates, at the rate of burn, it will cost over £1 million to burn it. I mean, it was obviously not £1 million in those days, but it was a lot. It was very fuel intensive. They obviously used the cheapest fuel they could, but because this area being near the coast, very prone to fog, and the burners would lift the fog above 200 feet so that aircraft could get down. Otherwise, they didn't have a chance of getting down. And in fact, before it was totally installed, there was one aircraft that came back from an operation, couldn't find the airfield at all. There's lots of radio messages recorded about it, and finally ended up coming down because they ran out of fuel at Toll St Darcy and killed all of the crew. They're buried in Malden Cemetery. But there was also a couple of American airmen that had sneaked down here for a crafty pint, and they came in to rescue, and they both got badly injured. One of them died instantly in the explosion, and the other one survived to get to hospital.
And that's part of what your research really has found out, is those personal stories, isn't it, about the crew that were in the local area, and a lot of them were crews from overseas, wasn't it? Yeah,
we had Canadians, Mexican, South African, Australian, New Zealand. There was a League of Nations, really, which probably was quite interesting for the local people.
And probably at that time, as you say, locals wouldn't have been perhaps familiar with people from right across the world like that, because back then a lot of people didn't travel.
Yeah, exactly. It must have been a huge shock to the whole village, which was set up as any other village for wartime with its local services, etc. ARP and Home Guard. And there was also an added service called the Auxiliary Army, which is Britain's secret army. All round this coast, because the coast was so vulnerable, they had trained up local people to be the British resistance, and they were so secret nobody knew who they were. There wasn't a unit in Bradwell as such, but there was another special duties section which they had radios, very much like on Hello Hello. They had a hidden radio and a radio operator. Now, we did have a secret radio in Bradwell, and we know exactly where it was, and in fact the wires for the mast are still up in a very old tree there, and the son of the radio operator is still living in the same house.
And of course, with all the farmland around and about, I mean, this would have been an area where the enemy could have parachuted troops into, could have perhaps launched a land raid because of the proximity to the sea as well.
Exactly. With quite shallow beaches, they could have got in with landing craft quite easily, and parachutists coming down. The airfield itself actually did host a German aircraft that came in and landed. He'd been across and bombed London, and some people say he got lost. I think he was just running low on fuel, saw an airfield and landed at Bradwell in a Ju-88. So the crew of 3 were taken prisoner and their aircraft was taken away for examination. We are trying to focus a lot on the human stories rather than the gallant operations. Yeah, we're recording all of the operations that went on, but we want to get to the human stories. How many women were working here? What roles did they do? Women in those days couldn't fly aircraft apart from the Air Transport Auxiliary, and we know that Air Transport Auxiliary did bring planes into Bradwell. So yeah, we've done quite a lot of research into the women here.
That's probably the interesting bit. Yes, there's the airfield. Yes, there's the operations that are probably well documented. But it's uncovering those additional stories to paint that much bigger picture, isn't it?
Exactly. We want to get the feeling of what life was actually about, not just the heroic Battle of Britain sort of things. Yeah, it's the stories of the people. I was reading only earlier on today that a lot of the public transport around here, which was probably pretty rare anyway, was always full of service people, mostly RAF. But there was one special bus once a month that took away pregnant women from the base. So they called it a maternity bus, or the local people say, oh, that's the maternity bus going. Well, once a month they used to do that. And there was quite a few marriages in the local church. I think I've counted up about 17 so far.
And Eric, I understand from your research that you've found a few additional names that aren't actually on the memorial here next to us.
Well, I think what's happened is that when that was research was probably a little bit harder. You'd have to go to museums, whereas nowadays you can find a lot of research online. One story that comes to mind is of a squadron that took off on a raid. As they took off, one pilot had problems with his aeroplane, actually crashed on the airfield, and before they could get to him, the aircraft erupted in flames, and two aircraft collided, or they think they collided. One certainly fell to pieces, and they presumed that pilot was dead, and the pilot of another aircraft was still... his aircraft was hit, but he was still talking on the radio and appeared to be okay. Whereas in fact the aircraft that fell to pieces, he survived. He must have bailed out and parachuted. And the other one was quite badly injured and captured. In fact, they both ended up in a prisoner of war camp. And the one that had crashed had serious injuries, was treated by the Germans, but died 2 or 3 months later, still in captivity, and his name doesn't appear on there yet.
And I guess there's perhaps hopes to include them at some point.
Yes, certainly. Once we're a bit more certain of what's going on, we will add the additional names. But that may be a never-ending job because we're always turning things up.
Yeah, well, we're alongside the memorial, as I've mentioned, and actually this track looks very reminiscent of an old airfield track. Quite a bit of it is still in place, isn't it?
Yeah, this is part of the old perimeter road. You can see some of the runways. In fact, the runway that's just across there, you can't really see it, but we're reliably informed. We've got a warbird expert by the name of Paul, who is pretty sure that they will be able to get an aircraft into here, smaller aircraft like a Piper Cub.
Well, that's the thing, because there is power lines I can see here that now go right across what would be the flight path of the airfield, because we're just a stone's throw away from what was the Bradwell Nuclear Power Facility, and I know that there are plans for a new power station to be built very close to here.
Certainly is, yeah. I mean, it's like a lot of the power stations, everything is in discussion stages. The planning inspectorate of the government did come down and view the place. I've not seen their report yet, but as many photographs as we could of the people that died were posted all around here. It looked quite amazing, and when you could see the actual names of them. So that was a quiet protest, as it were. To me, as somebody who doesn't live in Bradwell, I think it's unfair for them to be given another nuclear power station when they've already had one.
The company who's behind the plans, and it is still in the planning stages at the point of recording, say that obviously the new power station will provide hundreds of jobs for people in the area, not just through the construction phase but through the operational phase, and that they'll do education sessions with the local schools as well, so that will help to upskill local children, so that by the time the plant's in operation they will be able to apply for the jobs to run it. So they will say that it's providing a boost to the local villages and towns around the Dengie Peninsula.
Yeah, that's providing that they do employ local people.
Well, Eric, enough about the future. You're very much looking at the history of Bradwell here. Where can people find out more?
Right, we do have a Facebook group. If you type in RAF Bradwell Bay for the Facebook group. We also have a website, rafbradwellbay.co.uk, and come along to one of our events. We've got a study day coming up on the 21st of August, where you get 3 lectures, one on Malden at war, one by the daughter of one of our previous station commanders, and I'm doing a talk on the last commanding officer, Geoffrey Stevenson. So come along and find us there. Look at our website, find what events we do. We're sort of in the planning stage of a 1940s event, but that's very much being planned and explored. But we are an active group. We also have the Bradwell Bay Preservation Group is a membership group as well, where for a subscription fee you get 2 or 3 newsletters a year, plus discount off of our events and outings and things as well. So, we're getting pretty active and well known.
Eric, thank you ever so much for joining me here on Essex by the Sea on our anniversary episode as well. Thank you very much.
Congratulations on your anniversary. I wish I'd known I'd have baked a cake.
Don't forget you can subscribe on your favourite podcast app and like and follow on social media as well. You can find Essex by the Sea on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. So until next time, thanks ever so much for listening.